Please welcome your panelists for the Future of Human Performance, moderated by founder and CEO of Lightdale, Jurgen Carney.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jurgen Carney, and welcome to the Future of Human Performance panel at the 5 o'clock time slot at the Milken Institute Global Conference, otherwise known as the Murderer's Row of panels today. And by the turnout in this very large room, I think we can see that this is a very important subject to many people. Whether you already consider yourself a top performer, whether you're interested in higher performance for yourself, for your organizations, the companies that you invest in, your philanthropies, or if you're really just trying to get an education about the science and methodology that goes into improving performance and how experts think about the science of human performance, that's what we want you to leave with today. We want you to leave with that understanding and a sneak peek into some incredibly exciting stuff. We'll forego long introductions, but I'll just tell you who everyone is on the panel. Starting to my right is Vivienne Ming, noted scientist who's doing some very remarkable things in terms of data, outcomes, and also technologies that enhance cognition and thinking. Next is Jurgen Heitmann, veteran of the United States Navy, veteran of the Navy SEALs, where he trained people, also did a substantial amount of work in that regard for the Central Intelligence Agency. And we'll have a unique perspective in terms of military application and how that transposes and translates into other spheres. Next to him is Allison Levine. Allison is an extraordinary polar explorer, a person who has led an all-female expedition that summited Mount Everest. What she probably won't tell you, and I'll just out her right now, is that she didn't start climbing until she was in her 30s, which is absolutely extraordinary when you think about the summit attempt and successful summiting. And last, but certainly not least, is sort of a dean of the space, Andy Walsh. And Andy's done many things. He's really the coach's coach in the field. The number one thing you need to know about him is that Andy was the person who created and ran the Human Performance Program for Red Bull. And if there's somebody in the room who doesn't understand what that means, you'll certainly know by the end of this panel. So, look, it's not necessarily a field you can get a master's degree in or major in an undergrad right now. So, Andy, you want to lead us off with a definition of human performance?
Yeah, for us it's sort of understanding human potential, and we do that through deep research, aggressive application of the research, and a feedback loop set up in that whole system where we're continually pushing the edge with the different communities we work with, and we're watching to see what truly humans are capable of and trying to use the science to understand that. And in the end game for us, it's about democratizing that down so that we can share those lessons back to the broader population.
So it's for the many, not the few.
For the many, yeah.
Does anybody have a view that there might be some inherent obstacles? Vivienne?
Yeah, there's some, hot mic. Better not tell a dirty joke right now. So, there's a lot of challenges in this space, not the least of which is defining what it is we're trying to actually achieve. So, I'm sure for many of you, you're really thinking about elite performance. It's largely, I suspect, a big part of what we're going to talk about here. But I'm interested in human performance from an 8 billion plus perspective. What does it take to get the most out of everybody in education, in workforce, in mental health? These are really big issues, and when you get out and start talking about everyone, sometimes you really start to pull in some big ethical questions as well. Who gets to decide how people live their lives? So let me throw out one additional definition. Paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science came out last year, and they looked at how I define human performance, which is when you're 65, what's your walking speed? How much did you average earnings in terms of income? What is your wealth? What's your social connectivity, your happiness, different biomarkers, insulin sensitivity? If you've lived a great life, all of those things are better. And looking at the things now, whether it's a 4-year-old or a 40-year-old that predict those outcomes and building those into people is what really my work has been very much about.
And there can be no outcomes orientation without data.
It is a very data-driven field. There's no doubt about it. And this is intensive data because we're talking about tracking people over very long time periods. And we're talking about looking at incredibly detailed things. So, we built a system once to look at students where we literally put microphones in the classrooms with kindergartners and recorded everything they said to get insights into what actually predicted the outcomes of the kids.
But Allison, there's human performance in the laboratory and on a white sheet of paper, and then there's human performance leading a team up a mountain where everybody's got to pull his or her and maybe someone else's weight, right?
Right. So my expertise is in leading teams in extreme environments. So whether it's a high mountain or a North Pole, South Pole expedition, the success is judged in terms of, is everybody coming back alive? Is everybody coming back with all their fingers and toes? We don't look at success in terms of, revenue or profit share or, market share, revenue, profit, anything like that. So it's different from normal environments in that these outcomes that we want are bring everybody back alive is always the number one goal. Number two, come back with all your fingers and toes. Number three, come back as friends with the people that you're with. That's what I look at when I look at human performance in these environments.
And Jurgen, as you've listened to the three definitions that have gone before, what would you add?
So I would add the one point, I think one of the greatest challenges these days is building a culture that really optimizes human performance and that mindset that drives that, both from an individual aspect, but more importantly, as we've learned, your individual performance is really driven by how you provide that performance to a team. And your whole mindset is always about your performance is inherently catalyzing a team to excel. And especially when you're living in a culture that's always driven to a no-fail type of end state, you have to think that way as a sense of accountability and responsibility to your team. So I think one of the biggest challenges in the future here is AI, augmented learning, robotics step into the picture. How do you fall back to those human factors that are critical, that anchor you into that drive, into that mission?
Andy, human factors. I hear this a lot in human performance. What are human factors?
It's a great question. We look at it through the lens of, one, we need to understand human performance through the science and the research. But I think the challenge we've faced in recent years, especially in many of the elite programs, is the ubiquitous and prevalence of the technologies that provide data sets. And in that set, you're starting to see this human becoming treated more like a data point than the actual original human they are. And so when we think about human factors, we consider the character, the empathy, the compassion, the courage. And when we're really trying to anchor an elite team, we're always focusing first and foremost on those elements. The challenge with a lot of that is that we call it measuring the unmeasurable. It's very hard to get a sense of how that is, where that state of that is, or the transition or the improvement of that within any given group. So we default to what we can measure, as in most organizations, but those are typically not the most important things. And given this point in time in history, we've never had the capacity to understand humans and the human factors in the way we have today, again, thanks to technology. And the remarkable thing is, imagine the power we have in our hands if we start to bring it to bear in the right and appropriate way, but don't lose sight of the fact that at the center of all this is a human. Right. And so a big thread for us is how do we continually to humanize the human in the face of all this pervasive technologies.
So it's an exercise in humanity, I understand that. But Vivienne, what are some of these ways that Andy is referring to where these very discrete technological advances that allow us to understand people's bits and points?
Yeah, so they're fairly diverse, really, and there's a point to come back to at the end about how it isn't fundamentally related to technology. We're looking at things, as Andy says, that are fundamentally human. But, for example, one of my companies, we built a data set of 122 million people. These were working professionals, and our promise to companies was, we'll find the employee that is exactly right for your company. Culture, they have the right skill set, but they have these ephemeral qualities. When we looked, it didn't matter if we were looking at software developers or salespeople, and we did some work, in fact, with the Office of Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we were also looking at potential officers. And what we were doing is taking all of this massive unstructured data that is available out there in the world, and we would go and collect it ourselves. So no one volunteered, but it was publicly available, and we pulled these data together. We used AIs to recognize that Thurston Howell III on LinkedIn was Crankosaurus on GitHub, and put them together. And then we said, all right, what actually predicts the best software developers, the best salespeople, the best skateboarders in the world, as it turns out, to get a Red Bull connection going? And we'd see the same thing, not one thing, but the same pattern of things across everyone. And we could not do it at that scale without the machine learning, without the data collection power.
What are some of those things? The same.
Well, here's one. Again, for the men in uniform up front here, I'm going to, forgive me if I get the terminology wrong, but great study. We looked at 10,000 West Point cadets and what predicted not their graduation rank, but terminal rank attainment. And it wasn't their grades. It didn't predict anything about terminal rank attainment. One of the things we found is that it's what we call endogenous motivation, that drive that comes from within. So you're doing it for yourself. If you're there because your grandfather graduated from West Point, and your dad graduated, and you're just following, if you're there to impress people, to brag about it, you will fail. If you were there for yourself, you take it. So we can add in a long set of general cognitive abilities, social skills, emotional intelligence, creativity, and then the big word here, metacognition. These are sort of the keys. No one of them is predictive, but when we see a pattern of strengths across those, it doesn't matter what you're going into, sales or the military. When you see strength in these areas, we see someone who will succeed.
Jurgen, you come from a tradition that at this point is multi-generational in terms of the institutionalization of the knowledge that it transmits for top performance. Does what you're hearing jibe with that? And are there other things that you and your experience have learned as key takeaways that are indications, if not outcomes, for top performance? And then I also want to come back to, should all this information actually be out in the public for everyone?
Yeah, the last question first, absolutely. Because I think this collaborative approach of learning these entities and understanding these character traits and what makes high performers, no matter what the arena is critical. Again, back to Andy's point, how do we democratize this whole piece? Because you're constantly raising the benchmark across the spectrum. And again, the point about studying elite performers, how do you then go from that small single-digit percentage and spread that out and really share that across the community through data analytics, both aggregated, or disaggregated information? And how do you use this unique environment now where the exponential growth of learning is just going off the charts? So I think one of the character traits we're looking for is, a lot of times you think of a high performer as a technician, and really kind of really refining the art of technician, but really it's that expert learner that we're looking at now. What are those character traits, both from a cognitive realm, because really in the cognitive realm is where we really are taking training to the next level. You always think a lot of times in the physical aspect, that's kind of like icing on the cake to make life a little less miserable, but the reality is the cognitive state. And how are we looking at those cognitive traits that are really going to be developed, that coachable, tactical athlete, quote unquote? How can you adjust and train someone, because you have to train in those environments to make those critical decisions. And you think about the future of what is being involved in the battle space at many different levels. You add on robots and robotics, swarms of drones, things like that. The cognitive load to decision makers and maneuver elements is just overwhelming, and it's increasingly, and sometimes exponentially getting greater and greater. So again, how do you train that individual? How do you develop these mind labs? You can train that just as you do any of the physical aspect, but more importantly, we're allowing the mindset of science and research to really drive that to another whole level. And I think that's a great transition into the future of human performance training.
I want to comment on that too. I just want to stress the importance when we talk about high performers, strong performers. Those aren't necessarily elite performers. You can be a really strong performer without being an elite performer. So, for example, to get to the top of Mount Everest or some other high peak, or to get to the North Pole or to the South Pole on skis, you don't have to be the best, fastest, strongest, most skilled climber or most skilled skier. You just have to be relentless about putting one foot in front of the other. And that can make you an extremely strong performer and not necessarily an elite performer. And then to kind of tag on to what Vivienne was talking about West Point, I spent 4 years on the part-time faculty in the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership, and they looked at
West Point.
At West Point,
yeah.
Yes. And they did some studies in my department about what causes cadets to drop out before the end of the first year or not make it through basic training. And it comes down to this grit factor, to the people that had grit, that determination and the relentless drive is a huge factor in what leads to their success.
So let me add in, we've all talked now about the power of data and sort of analytics to characterize a person and set out some of the traits that are interesting. So what excites me now is the possibility to use the same things to actually engineer the experiences. If what we're talking about is this crucial sort of cognitive and emotional character of someone that really predicts success, can we intervene on that and create the person that we want to? If we want to democratize this, we need to be able to deliver a set of experiences that will transform a person. Obviously, it's a space I'm passionate about, so I'll give you a very tangible example. We're partnering with my think tank in Accenture, building a system to forecast the career trajectories of 430,000 employees, and then identify the moments in their lives where we can actually intervene and drive them towards better outcomes. And what that intervention means is everything's on the table. The people they're working with, so their peer mentors, the leader on the team, the actual work assignment, all built and structured to drive those outcomes. So none of it's arbitrary. Everything is designed to grow that person.
Vivienne, you said you were obviously passionate about it. Why are you obviously passionate?
Well, I'm passionate about it because, so my wife has this line, if you don't believe people can change, you shouldn't be a teacher. I happen to believe that you probably shouldn't be a manager or much of anything else dealing with other people. Everyone can be amazing. Not everyone can be amazing in every single way. And this is one area where my work may differ from some of the elite work or turn them into elites sort of approach, where I get real people in a lot of my work. 430,000 people, some of them are phoning it in. How do I take that person and transform them? And now we can get deep into behavioral economics and what it takes to engineer, something that will transform someone's life experience. It's hard.
Before we do, Andy, I wonder, you get athletes, you have gotten athletes coming to you at interesting points in their careers where they are champions. They have attained pretty extraordinary feats, and they were looking to go to yet another level, right? To break through, in the parlance. I mean, is that something that requires so many resources and so much effort that it can only be concentrated on an individual? I mean, when you talk about democratizing access to this type of methodology and technology, I mean, you're talking about a lot of infrastructure, aren't you? And scaffolding around people.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in the past we did, because we didn't know enough about the business. We didn't know enough about how the extraordinary across sport, business, military, the arts, how they attained that level of performance. And so for us, in the very first stages, the elite was a way to look at capacity, to see what humans were truly capable of. So when you look at an elite portfolio of talent across the thousands of disciplines and areas of mastery we have, you just see these amazing feats that sort of reinforce in your mind, as you said, Vivienne, people are capable of extraordinary things. Then comes the science, which we've spent a lot of time and energy over the years now trying to hack into that and really pick that apart. But I think the beauty of this sort of growth in technology, explosion of technology, is the core principles, again, back to those sort of fundamental human factors around character and that. there's some basic lessons you can bring down straight away. And if you're trying to break a 2-hour marathon, yes, we're going to have to pour, or Nike recently poured a staggering amount of resources into trying to break a 2-hour marathon. But 5% of that information passed down to every kid in the country trying to run a better 5K would have a profound impact. Right. And we're always looking to say, if we can understand just that scale and capacity and what's possible, one, from an inspiration perspective, if we are wanting to share, and two, how do we get 1% of the world access to this the opportunity to improve 1% on a global scale? That would be profoundly. And it's not going to be the fancy science and the genetic testing and the brain scans and the metabolic analysis. It's going to be those really simple things that we start. And funnily enough, at the very top tier, when people are really trying to push to that whole next level, we've typically done with all the technical analysis, and we're really anchoring into who are they, what do they stand for, and what is it about them that they want to make an impact with and moving that direction? Because at that point, it all comes down to those characters.
So you talk about getting to a place where actually the technical stuff goes away, and it's almost spiritual, really, in terms of the exploration. You also mentioned before the arts. You included the arts. How do you utilize the arts in analyzing human performance? And I think, Vivienne, you have a view on that also. But yeah.
I mean, we were fascinated. Again, I grew up as a coach in the sporting arena, so anchoring there, watching elite talent in that field. But it became very obvious to us that even the top athletic talent, if we sink just there, are world class in that they redefine how that sport may be played. They design the future of that sport. They become the flagship role person of that particular craft.
Tom Brady earlier today.
Exactly. So by definition, they are creating a new way of doing that particular art or craft. So when we had the opportunity to work with a lot of artists and musicians, designers and filmmakers, we suddenly realized that creativity in its essence is probably a parallel skill set that crosses all domains. And whether you're solving very technical mission set problems in Jurgen's world, whether you are in the research lab and you're trying to crack that code to that new insight, or whether you're trying to pick a different route up a mountain, that the essence of creativity manifested across all the elites that we particularly we had the opportunity to work for. And so we spent a lot of time and energy trying to understand that so that we could then train towards it, which I'd love to say we got there, we made progress, but there's still so much opportunity in that space.
Jurgen, we've talked a lot about individuals, right? But obviously when people talk about the SEALs, it's actually referred to, I think, internally as the teams, right? So talk about teams. Talk about team top performance, training for that. I mean, what are the key drivers? But more importantly, I think for the audience, what are the key techniques that you can share?
Well, I think a lot of guys out in the audience know this. You know, it's this mindset of each individual at a level of being quote-unquote elite, but not elitist. So there's this humility aspect. So we drop back down to this mindset of being, you know, as we can call the beginner's mindset. So you're always there observing and learning and trying to make yourself better every day in your actions contributing to the team. There's also this mindset of always being in a selective state. And some of that is literally. So it's this humility to learn. And we know in our culture, and we've had the privilege from day one that when you do training, after every evolution, you're always debriefing each other. You're doing an after-action report, or you're doing lessons learned, and you're developing this respect, transparency, and trust to communicate effectively, because as a team, you want to be better the next day. So this mindset of pursuit of excellence, how do you get better 1% every single day? You strive for that. I mean, you just thrive in that environment to think that way. So you take a group of individuals now that are constantly thinking that way, and then training as a team through constant repetition, rehearsals, much harder than the expectations are, consistently develops that kind of that high-performing mindset. And you can apply that in any arena again. But it's developing that culture and that mindset, but more so the disciplined process of how to learn of any, you know, very high-performing learning organization.
Thank you. Allison, how realistic is it for anybody outside having the entire resources of the United States Department of Defense to marshal, that type of effort when, you've got to go out and get sponsorship, you've got to figure out what your routes are, you got to, you're doing it on a kind of civilian dime versus a different type of resourcing. Is this really only for the Navy SEALs?
No, it's not. Not only is it not only for the Navy SEALs, but I think it's for everybody. And when we look at creating these high-performing teams and these elite teams, something I really want to remind people of is that even the best, strongest, most elite performers can have a crappy day on the mountain or in the field or wherever jumping from space, wherever they happen to be at the time. Those people can have a crappy day too, and especially when you're in these remote, extreme environments, emotions are heightened. So when you're happy, you're super happy, and when you're down on yourself, you're really down on yourself. And so it's just a reminder that the best people can have a bad day, so it's so important to look around, be aware of how everybody else is not only performing, but how they're feeling. And a few kind words to somebody can completely change an outcome for that person and for that entire team. It doesn't cost anything to say a few nice things to somebody, to be encouraging. It's easy to put a smile on your face and just give a few words of encouragement. And for me, because of my size, the law of physics basically dictates that I am never going to be the fastest, strongest person on any of my teams. If I'm hauling a 150-pound sled across 600 miles of Antarctic ice, my teammates who are 6'3", 6'4", 230 pounds are going to be able to haul their gear and supplies faster than I can. So I was never going to be out front, but I could always be the person with the smile on their face, to put funny notes in people's tents at night, or to make funny pictures in the snow, so when they got out of their tent in the morning, they'd see a hilarious message to them or something. And just keeping people's spirits up in these remote environments is really, really important, and that alone can change the outcome.
Vivienne?
So I'm just trying to imagine you pulling more than you. Here are 4 things we see in high-performance teams. The first is called psychological, and then I'm going to finish with a science-fictional approach to how we optimize it in our work. So one is psychological safety, which you might call trust. It takes a long time to develop. You don't get it for free on day one. Another is communication. Not a big shock there, but it turns out literally when people are having a great discourse, the temporal lobes sync up. I'm not going to explain what I mean, but it's like you're watching mind reading happening. The next is skepticism. Turns out that is something you get for free from people that are very, very different from one another. Yeah. But we wouldn't see it a lot in this room, to be honest, because you're not very different. You wouldn't be appropriately skeptical of one another. And the last one is what I call complementarity, that people complement themselves well. I don't mean saying nice things. I mean that everyone has weaknesses. You want to engineer teams such that all of the strengths complement the weaknesses, and everything gets covered, and everyone has this clear role in some level. So how do we go about doing this? Well, I'm a crazy mad scientist, so we take whole teams, and we can actually wire them up, watch their brains simultaneously in real time, and short-circuit the process of building communication and trust. We can actually see the neural signatures of essentially what you might call bubble-type investing behavior. We can see the neural signature of you're not making rational judgments because you're taking other people's opinions too seriously. And then lastly, that last one, it turns out it's incredibly difficult, but using some of the mathematics developed for what's called deep neural networks, modern AIs, we can actually kind of treat people like they were parts of an AI, and we can optimize team performance. It has a lot of mathematical challenges, but we can actually find here are likely teams that will be most complementary with one another and therefore most successful to run forward. So this, again, is much more sort of approaching how do we take what we've learned hard, because none of this is pure data discovery. Tons of knowledge imported in this domain, but now make it available in a massive organization.
Jurgen, how long does it take the military, particularly elite ends of the military, to integrate that type of scientific research into practice?
I mean, it's already doing that. It doesn't take long because I think, again, getting to this mindset of constantly learning, you're looking for that, and we're looking for it outside the groupthink spaces. So just the way as we're looking into business and other fields, same with technology, how can we accelerate that learning piece. So again, you have that mindset, that desire to look for those types of best practices and skill sets and technology that can enhance this learning, and then training to it, and then training to the nth state. So as we are training in all different entities across the military, we're also collecting data at the exact same time. So it's reinforcing what we're thinking and feeling, psychological aspect, but the data is just absolutely right there too to drive one way or the other.
It's all sounding pretty rosy. I've never been in a business environment or a team environment where there wasn't at least one negative influence,
Right.
or perhaps even a spoiler, at least one, right? I mean, to me, leading teams has always been an exercise in overcoming a certain amount of factionalism in order to prevail for the greater good. Maybe I haven't done it right. Andy, I mean, is this a bit of an idealized vision here that we're executing against, or is there a better way to engineer teams now, given the science of human performance?
I think it depends on your standards, probably out the gate. I think if you are operating in such a highly volatile environment where failure just really can't be tolerated for whatever reason it may be, and you've raised your standards to there, then we all have had those teams where people are one or two people on the program aren't really lined up, but if that's detracting from that and adding risk to that situation, then there's no compromise. You have to make a decision to either invest heavily in them to help them move and understand, or, as we say, if the juice isn't worth the squeeze, you have to cut it out. Yeah. And I think everybody has different versions of teams that they've been on. And what's wonderful about the science is that, the old days we would just keep running you and pushing you through hell until the rest survived, and then those people were good to go. The art of it is still there, but the science and labs like Vivienne's, but there's thousands of labs like hers around the world pushing the frontiers of what's possible in terms of not only our understanding of human capabilities and the science behind it, but the possibility of how we can interact or interject. But they're not talking to each other. This is the terrifying thing. And it's, unless you're in the business, you don't actually get to see over the fence very often. Right. So one of my biggest frustrations is, and part of why we're trying to bring this conversation to the world, is that if we could just get those communities sharing that information at a high level, it would have a profound impact on how we look at humans and understand humans.
This goes to another question I have. Is that because, in fact, there's competition between these labs and these elements? I mean, it seems to me that you worked in the private sector previously at the company I mentioned before. So, there was a lot of passion and joy in what you were doing, but it gave the company a competitive edge. It enhanced the brand, right?
It did. But our biggest strength was we were completely open. We set a very high standard for sharing our information, because it started many years ago when I was working in professional sports, and a GM said we can't tell anybody what we're doing. And first and foremost, there are no secrets in what we're all doing. I mean, there's people pushing the edges in space. And the reality is, in even professional sports, you trade that person, the next year they run over to the next team and tell them everything you were doing anyway. So at most, your advantage is a few months. And what we found by opening our doors and actually becoming sharing our information around human factors is people started to come and then they share. And then this is the sort of energy that we were looking for. And we're all in our community, we all were, like Jurgen pointed out, we're all fascinated in how to make it that much better. So we're all sharing with a common vision of trying to improve the whole field. And if you invent something very technically, competitive advantage in, say, motorsports or, in some of those fields, you're not going to give that up straight away. But it doesn't take long for the competition to catch up. So there's always this idea of the more you share, the bar just keeps getting rises for everyone. And your job is just to be better than the person next to you.
Yeah, so could you go crazy being interdisciplinary in this field? It sounds to me that this is not your Gatorade commercial from 30 years ago, obviously, right?
I think this is a fundamentally interdisciplinary field. You can't understand people if you don't. I started as a not just a neuroscientist, a theoretical neuroscientist. And if you don't know what that is, just substitute lazy for theoretical. So we'd simulate brains on computers and teach them how to do stuff. And all of this modern AI stuff came right out of my field. So blame me and my fellows. And by the way, as a total aside to the question you just asked Andy, one of my professors way back when, there was a big initiative around sharing data in neuroscience. And he said, I'm happy to share my data as soon as I've wrung every single paper's worth of data out of it for myself. Then I'll share it with anyone else. So it's tough. Competition is tough in academia, and nobody wants to lose their edge. But by going out there and being interdisciplinary, and for me, that's neuroscience, economics, sociology, psychology mixed together with machine learning and others, that is working in academia and in philanthropy and in the business world interchangeably on the same projects and sharing everything across them. Otherwise, I don't get to learn. If I really want to know how to change someone, I need to know a person. And you are a great many things right now, even in front of me. To think all you are is your brain, I'm not going to make a lot of progress. But to understand that you came from a certain place, and therefore it sets a social schema of who you are. I'm not going to go down this path of describing what I mean, but turns out combining these things together makes the entire thing more powerful. And all we've done in our work is bring in new fields and new people. Now when I launch a new project, the first thing I do is I got to hire a new economist, cognitive scientist, and data scientist, because I know I'm going to need at least them to make progress on any new project.
Allison, do you need a translational element to sort of to draw the parallel, the metaphor between this and sort of medical research, right? This is a lot of stuff that is being turned into knowledge, data that's being turned into knowledge. Is there a filter that you employ as the person who has to actually go out and perform, or are you up to it yourself?
Well, a lot of the success or failure that I experience in the environments that I'm in really comes down a lot to the team and who's on the team and how much they're willing to give. And there's I serve as a senior fellow at the Coach K Center on Leadership and Ethics at Duke, so we get to hear Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski, talk a lot. And he's the winningest coach in the history of men's Division I, of all college basketball. Now it used to just be men's Division I, but now all of Division I college basketball. And he talked about the Olympic team and coming back after winning the gold medal, and we were asking him what was important to him in pulling these teams together and getting them to work together. And one of the things he talked about was what he calls team ego. He said, I want people on my team who are going to feel proud to be a part of something that collectively feels more important than the individuals alone. Name on the front of the uniform, Team USA, more important than the name on the back of the uniform, the individual name. So when I'm looking at my performers and people that I want on a team and I'm trying to figure out how well people are going to do, I really look for people that have that sense of team ego, and that is such a huge part of what's going to determine how well our team.
So one of the constructs we look at is purpose, and defined as something that's bigger than you that you won't accomplish in a short period of time. It's literally a predictor of whether a congenital condition will actually be expressed as a disease, how much money you'll make, how far you'll go in your education. Sounds like a very soft thing, but it ties directly into qualities like this.
Right? Jurgen, purpose, short term, sounds like this is right up your alley.
Yeah, I was just thinking in the discussion here as we talk about the future of teams and human performance, how do you reimagine human performance, again, to one of the things I said in the beginning, when you start looking in front of the headlights here in the future, when robots are part of your team? What is that team interaction? What is the psychology that now is involved in that? The science that's going to be looking at that. When you have, instead of dog handlers, you have robotic dogs doing, and that's, as you've seen in the videos, Jeff Bezos' dog, that's a reality. And, there's a lot of different dynamics that'll go there. And, in our field, we're always pushing the edge. So now how do you look at team performance and human performance with a mix of that? You're already seeing that in medicine. And it's interesting when we've seen teams that are using just strictly robotic surgery, there's a different nuance, and you have to train to that too to perform at that level. So again, getting in front of those headlights is critical to start thinking about that now, because that's going to be a reality very, very quickly.
So let's step back from the conversation for a moment, because I think we've gone pretty far in terms of the state of the field, but you all have also defined a pretty lofty sense of purpose about why you're in it. What does it plug into? What's the natural home for the field of human performance in, say, either in academia, in corporate culture, in the world of athletics, in the military? Because what I see is a lot of, as you pointed out, Andy, a lot of efforts being done in a lot of centers in many places. But what needs to happen? Does there have to be a human performance education effort for K-6, K-12 teachers? How early on should we be thinking about human performance in order to integrate it into how we as human beings learn and grow? Anybody want to?
So
yeah.
I think one thing that's really, really important is when we look at even younger kids or young adults, whatever, and trying to train them to be the best that they can be and whatever that happens to be for them, is the importance of failure tolerance. Because if people are so afraid to fail, then that's going to really stifle progress and innovation and prevent people from taking risks to begin with. And so who here knows the names Sir Edmund Hillary or Tenzing Norgay? Right? You guys know these people, right? First guys to ever summit Mount Everest. But guess what? There were dozens of climbers who tried and failed before those two made it to the top. But those two had the benefit of all the 411, right? All the information from those previous climbers. And maybe if those other guys hadn't had the guts to try first, even though they didn't make it, then maybe Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay would never have made it. So I think we get so wrapped up in studying uber successful people, but we also have to stop and look at the people who have failed and really study them, because sometimes those guys are just doing other people a favor because they're paving the way for the people who are going to follow in their footsteps down the road.
To tie in that comment with our earlier discussion about leadership, there was, so I do a lot of work with little kids. I mean, in some cases, very, very little kids. And we build technologies to help parents with newborns all the way up through 12-year-olds, so all sorts of different work. And turns out if you look at all these educational technologies, turns out most of them don't do very much. Like the research on them is really mixed, and it was totally perplexing. And then finally someone did a big meta-study, and they found a very simple phenomenon. If parents had a fixed mindset, the app didn't work no matter what. Only the parents had a growth mindset about their kids. So not just that they believed they could change, but that their children could change. When that happened, then the technology had a chance to actually transform the child. Otherwise, it didn't matter. We found the same thing. And some of what we're talking about has been these cognitive qualities. Well, the simple truth is, by about 5 to 8, most of cognition in terms of what we're talking about is a maintenance game. It's pretty fixed epigenetically by that point. So if we're talking about things like working memory span and literacy and attention, there's not much that I can add on to. I can do all sorts of subtracting from then on, but I can't add a lot. So going in with little kids, if we're talking about robotics and the future of work, I do a lot of work in that space. That's kind of what the Accenture project is all about. They don't want to lay off 200,000 people who worked hard, went to university, did everything right, but they're really not the kind of creative, adaptive problem solver that the future economy needs. How do we take people like that and transform them into people that still have value to add to our economy? That turns out is a brutally tough question, and you have to do both of these. What do we do with little kids? And what do we do with these people that are already in the economy but have been prepared for a dead end, and there's nowhere for them to go in 10 to 20 years?
Right. Thank you. Jurgen, you have a view in terms of when to get people and when to integrate it?
No, I think it's obvious we need to get them when they're young because of that exact point, the cognitive growth there. But it's also, so important that you, again, develop this mindset that it's not win or lose, it's win and learn. So, it's that nuance of, again, creating a mindset and teaching children that failing is actually a learning process, and it's not failing. So somehow, how do you articulate that and understand that? And that goes back to the education piece, both for adults and children.
And
that,
you may,
yeah, sorry, go
oh,
ahead.
I was going to say, you may know more about this than I do. You definitely do. But doesn't Israel start tracking their fighter pilots when they're in elementary school or something? They identify these kids when they're quite young, and they can tell that they're going to be strong performers, and they start tracking these future pilots when they're in elementary school.
So think about it now, esports.
Yeah.
I mean, think of the dynamic of esports here in the future and the cognitive skills that the children are learning at this point here. And there's a whole completely untapped area there of what is being taught to children through esports. I mean, it's an NCAA sport. It's going to be in the Olympics soon. I mean, there's a new dynamic there. And again, how do we get in front of that and learn from the cognitive realm and how we're shaping that, or how it's shaping them? And the majority of parents really don't truly understand that because they haven't lived through that. Some have, but that's a unique aspect right then and there. I don't know, Andy, if you have any more comments on that.
I would just interject there, for those of us who read science fiction, there's some good stuff out there, not the least of which is Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, right? Which talks, which envisages a world just like that. Andy?
Well, I think it's, as I said earlier, this is this unique time in human history now where this understanding of what humans are capable of is at our fingertips. To your earlier point, what we need before we even start to push it aggressively downstream is, I think there's like a cottage industry, is how we refer to our community, and some way of aggregating the intelligence and the IP around this is sort of what Jurgen and I have been focusing on a lot. And how do we bring together the brightest and best in the world who are understanding and pushing the edges with humans day to day, and then at that point using the science and technology to demystify it in many cases. So that we can pass it down. The simple things with the youth have the biggest impact. It's not all the science and technologies that we may use on a very elite individual. It's those simple, fundamental, more humanistic factors that I think have the greatest impact. But you want to also make sure you're backed by the science, and I think we need to get to that point. And as I said earlier, the notion that we see capacity with some of the best performers in the world doesn't mean that they're fundamental tenets, good and bad. There's a negative side to being great, as we all know.
What would that be?
I mean, there can be just this a compulsive addiction to their craft that, as you all know, you've all seen it, even in business, that drives people to negate all the other things in their world and focus solely on success in that particular world. And that looks like a very addictive behaviour, whether it's in the business or whether it has some other story associated with respect to alcohol and drugs.
So define. You bring up a really interesting point, all of you. Please define for me the difference between that negative addictive behavior and an obsession with excellence. Because if we're talking about a paradigm like Jurgen says, where you're rehearsing, you're a constant, you're beginner, a constant beginner mindset, right? I mean, aren't you then always engaged in procedures and process that would sort of mean that you're the kind of person who's just going to focus on doing what you want to do the best of your ability, and perhaps even with competitive drive, better than anybody else?
No, that's one aspect, but the other aspect is, in our fields, there's this creative mindset and this innovative mindset that are always looking at pushing the edges, and edges outside of just what we normally do. So how do you become better? By looking way outside those things. And I think, again, when you go back to, our youth and our children on the computers and esports, there's a very creative mindset that's spinning in there. How do we tap into that, and develop that out and shape that for a positive outcome? Because, again, we all know, we're really, truly shaped by experiential learning. But a lot more of the days now of children 8 to 10 hours in front of a screen, that's their experiential learning. And the future of experiential learning for a lot of these folks is virtual reality, immersive video, Ready Player One stepping into the picture. How is that going to shape, or how do we balance the two? So there's a lot to think about there.
Sorry, Andy. Given my work developing technologies for parents and schools and so forth, I guess asked a question I'm really totally unqualified to answer in terms of personal experience. I have 2 kids, but I'm a terrible parent. People nonetheless come to me and say, "How can I be a better parent?" It's a very standard question. And my answer to them, which is 100% accurate and totally useless, is be a better person. be the person you want your child to be. It turns out what we role model, and by the way, we see this in leadership inside organizations as well, what you role model is 100 times louder than the directive actions you take. You know, go study this, do that, I expect you. A lot of that actually has negative associations with it. So we talked about the negative side of performance, so let me share this. When I was growing up, I mean from a very young age, people told me I'd win a Nobel Prize someday. And somehow I was supposed to be a kicker in the NFL at the same time. I don't know how that was going to work out, but whatever. By the time, I mean, you could already see it, quite frankly, by 2 years of age, that I was struggling. Not that I wasn't smart, but that I was struggling to participate, to find a reason why I should do any of this. I almost flunked out of high school. I did flunk out of college, and then I was homeless for many years. I've done some pretty amazing things with the last 10 to 15 years of my life, none of which should have happened. I should have been dead in my car 20 years ago. And how that didn't happen is a total mystery to me. But it is evidence of how someone who does have some exceptional qualities can easily still slip through the cracks, learn all of the wrong lessons about what's important, which is you are supposed to be this person. And if you do not succeed at the right level, you are a failure, which, by the way, was never what my parents said. The fact that I was able to come back later in my life. So I went back to the same university I flunked out of 10 years later. I did my entire undergraduate degree in a single year and got perfect scores in every class. Same person, at the same school, nominally studying the same things. But it wasn't what I was doing, it was why I was doing it that mattered. Mm-hmm. That is what had transformed over those years. And then the role modeling that my parents had done for me was there for me to fall back on. Amazingly, despite being almost an applied mathematician for a good chunk of my career, you know, I couldn't remember how to do basic calculus at that point. It wasn't that mattered. It was every deep thing they'd laid. And as soon as I realized it wasn't about me, it wasn't about my happiness, it was about whether I was serving my purpose, that I could actually live up to at least some of those original expectations.
Thank you for sharing that. Andy?
I think you nailed it, Vivienne. I think we have a saying in the business, better at who you are and then better at what you do. And to your point about balance and obsessive compulsive, when better at what you're doing impacts negatively who you are and what you stand for, that imbalance is where we see problems. And I think
that's very quantifiable, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is, because I think you may be able to tolerate, and in your world, you may be able to have a lifestyle that looks from the outside very much obsessive and wouldn't work for you as an individual, but that person has figured out, and if they're navigating that successfully, but if they sacrifice their core values and what they stand for, then it doesn't matter how far they go, that will undermine their success in the long run and bring them down.
Thank you. Jurgen?
Yeah, you just think, you know, and you could just reflect inside this audience here. High performers are just masters of compartmentalization. You don't have any fear, you don't have any pain, don't have any weakness. I'm going to just keep driving, and that's what'll happen. You know, you can drive down there. So again, when you start developing a culture where you have these deeper discussions, lessons learned, sharing of information to make yourself and others better, that respect and that self-reflection is really kind of the definition of humility. You know, you're leaving your ego at the door, you're leaving that compartmentalization individual at the door, and you're there to learn and reflect and build a team better. And that kind of mindset is really what drives an organization to another whole level.
I was going to say, that's what drives me too when I'm training for a big climb. It's that fear of letting my team down, and that's what makes me so obsessive about training as much as I can, because I don't want to let the team down, and I want to show up and be as prepared and as strong as I possibly can, especially knowing that I'm most likely going to be at a disadvantage because of my size. But the other thing that makes it a little bit easier is I've come to the realization that I have a lot of weaknesses that I will never overcome, but I can compensate for them. So I've learned to compensate rather than overcome these weaknesses. And I think that's something that it's really important for everybody to remember when it comes to people within your organization and you really want them to be better and you feel that they have these weaknesses that they need to overcome. There are people that will never overcome certain weaknesses. So instead of expecting that focus on being the person that can help them find their sweet spot and help them feel like they're able to contribute in a different way. And if you can do that for somebody who's a weaker performer to begin with, you'll often get a higher level of performance out of them than you would have gotten out of them had they been an on-par performer with everybody else to begin with.
So we have time for some questions. I'd like to preface this by saying, please make it a question. Don't give us a statement or a homily. I reserve the right to cut you off, and you know, direct the question or make it general. That's fine. So raise hands. This right here. Yeah. There we go. No. Why don't we
shout it out and we can repeat the question.
We get shouted out, or we get another microphone over here.
First of all, thanks. This has really been fascinating. Okay. I'm sure everybody here feels the same way. We've been to a lot of panels, and what you're talking about is my
This is the best one.
By far.
All of them?
By my vote. Panel. I can't speak for everybody else. My question, and you got a little bit into it, Vivienne, about children, but it's interesting about climbing a mountain, sports, etc., SEAL team. The question is the U.S. educational system. And I'm intrigued to hear that we're paying all this money for all you folks to do things for the Department of Defense or wherever you've been working. But the money that should be spent. So what are you doing about that? What are you trying to do about it? Give us a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
So the biggest surprise to me about the American education system is that it starts at 5 years of age. That is completely inexplicable to me. So much of who a person is, by infants begin to learn how to value things by watching adults strive to attain, and some great empirical research there. So I mean, we're talking by a few months of age, they're already learning what's important based on how the adults around them interact in space. Who they are is getting laid down. The Nobel Prize winner, James Heckman at University of Chicago, estimates that investing in kids pays off at 14% a year. I mean, I bet you all wish you knew how to get a guaranteed 14% a year. Well, there it is. If kids were bonds, they'd be the backbone of the world economy. But, you know, bluntly, we don't want to invest in other people's kids. So we went straight to the parents in this case. So we do some joint projects with UNICEF China, helping parents there. I do work in South Africa with the new government, in Singapore. Really, it's not a uniquely American thing. It is that we don't educate kids before 5, but that we have challenges around very performance-based and assessment-based education is a global problem, and it's only going to get worse because jerks like me are going to build AIs that will do all the jobs we train those people for. And by the way, teaching people how to program isn't going to transform any of that. I'd be shocked in 10 years if the vast majority of code wasn't written by AIs. We need creative performers that do what they believe is right. We need explorers, and we're not building those people. And it starts at 8 weeks.
I'll just one simplistic view on this thing. You know, I think the greatest learning, again, is experiential learning, and nature is our playground. And you think about how children develop creativity outside of nature, just that fundamental concept, you know, of allowing education to take kind of the risk mitigation out of the picture a little bit more and really look at what can be taught and learned in nature is significant.
And I'll just throw in a passion point for us. We need to continue working to understand with the communities we do, because that's where the resources are being delivered right now, and I agree 100%, and right or wrong. But there's no reason if we can understand the application, and this is something we're deeply focused on now, the application of the IP, the aggregation of the IP around human factors, the working knowledge and the science and the research to really crack the code to human behavior. There's enough resources to pay for that to happen at the elite level. That should be then distributed for free, and it can be distributed for free. We're trying right now to understand what's that model look like. Basically, use the best in the world, or the people with the resources who are funding these sorts of programs, to come together, use the machine to bring all that IP into a usable and scalable format, and then a mechanism by which that can be delivered downstream and open access for everybody, because that's the model that I think really sets us up.
Before we run out of time, I want to make sure we have a plug for the session, Andy and Jurgen, that you're leading tomorrow. Will you tell everybody what it's going to be?
Want to do it?
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, we're experiential coaches. So tomorrow morning we agreed to come and obviously speak on this panel because we thought we could learn so much. But tomorrow morning we want to give back a little. So at 6:30 in this room, we're going to do a little exercise. It's kind of a combination of Jurgen's former world with Bud's and my world with surf survival. You get to do a breath holding exercise, which will quietly and gently nurse you through, but you'll come up against your own edge, and the lesson or the opportunity is how do you respond when you hit that little edge, and you'll be blown away by the progression people could make. And
so you're going to very gently waterboard them.
And if you're here today, you're going to automatically get a wake-up call at 5:30 a.m. so you can make it to the session.
Yeah, that's that AI.
Please. We've done it a few times recently with groups just like yourselves, and people have pushed in about an hour or so session, 5.5 minutes in a breath.
Fantastic.
Wow.
So that's what you can expect to try.
Let's take one more question from this gentleman here. Yeah.
Help me understand the contradiction between the 14% return and that now kids are dependent on their parents until age 31 financially, or the contradiction between what you just said, that your youth was, you know, a disaster, sorry to summarize it that way, versus then becoming brilliance. I mean, you know, that's a contradiction. How, why, who?
Well, the first isn't a contradiction. We're talking about how an empirical experiment went through and actually measured, if we directly invested in early education, what the payoff was. Fairly thorough bit of work, and there's some great published stuff there. You don't do that, and yes, you end up with people that vastly underperform for the rest of their life. And in some sense, that was me. Now, the contradiction there is, how did I spontaneously go through this? We don't have the time to describe what it means to sit in a car with a gun in your hand and think, why should I be alive? But that's what it was for me, and I would guess 19 out of 20 people, or 19 out of 20 times, someone like me would have pulled the trigger. So why I was different, I can't really tell you, but it was, and that was literally the moment where I realized that it wasn't about me.
I think we can use this as an interesting and poignant place to wrap. I think what the unexpected thing that at least I got from the panel is that while the science of human factors and human performance is elaborate, it can be data-driven, it's visceral in terms of relentlessness, and putting one foot in front of the other, that there's kind of a transgenerational approach that organizations have, and a team-based DNA approach, and that you can go to all kinds of interesting disciplines to get knowledge about top performance, including the arts. I think at its core, what you've all said that's very interesting is that it comes back to human values. And it comes back to an authentic alignment with human values. And taking all those different approaches to make sure that those values are inculcated and reinforced, it's obvious that these four individuals on this panel are doing their very best to do that. And I would hope that we would all support them in their efforts to democratize access and promotion of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Hey.